Hello everyone, future applicants, welcome to the Financial Information File tutorial of the 2025 Innovation Fund Call for Net Zero Technologies. This tutorial has been prepared by the Financial Engineering team of CINEA, the European Climate, Infrastructure and Environment Executive Agency. Today, I will present you how to complete the new Financial Information File which must be used for the application to the 2025 Innovation Fund Call for Net Zero Technologies. First, we will explain what the Financial Information File is and what its objectives are, before walking you through an illustrative example. Finally, we will provide guidance on how and when to submit questions to the Innovation Fund Help Desk, as well as where to find additional information. The Financial Information File, also called the Detailed Budget Table or Relevant Cost Calculator, is a mandatory annex to be submitted as part of the application. The template is available on the Funding and Tenders portal of the European Commission. It is compulsory for this call to use the new version of the Financial Information File and not any other versions from previous Innovation Fund calls. A brief word on the purpose of the Financial Information File. The Financial Information File collects applicants' financial data in a standardized format to enable for consistent assessment of the credibility and soundness of each project's cash flow projections. The template also automatically calculates the relevant costs and the maximum grant amount applicants are allowed to request for their project. The template also calculates the cost efficiency ratio, which is one of the key award criteria of the call. In practice, the assumptions and financial projections used in the Financial Information File are based on the applicant's own detailed financial model, which is also a mandatory document of your application. Applicants must also ensure consistency of the assumptions presented in the Financial Information File with those detailed in the business plan and with any evidence presented in other annexes of the application. Applicants can combine sheets of the Financial Information File with the sheets of their detailed financial model if it helps to ensure consistency in the data used for both models. However, please bear in mind that applicants are still required to submit the Financial Information File and the detailed financial model as two distinct mandatory documents. Both documents are mandatory, and failure to submit both documents separately will lead to a rejection of the proposal. Before we go into the details of the Excel template, let me first outline what changed in the Financial Information File this year compared to the versions used for previous calls of the Innovation Fund. This information is especially relevant for those who have already experience with our program. In short, this new version builds up on the template used for past calls, and the key features of the model and relevant cost formulas remain the same compared to the last call. The adjustments introduced this year in the Financial Information File relate to clarifications that will hopefully facilitate the computation of relevant costs and will help you to ensure compliance with the updated relevant cost methodology. We really hope that the changes introduced will help you and will reduce the number of errors that might be penalized during evaluation. For example, in the Introduction and Definitions tab, we updated the list of items to be excluded from relevant costs calculation in line with the updated list in the relevant cost methodology. In the input sheet, we added the country of implementation for the automatic computation of country-specific parameters in the WACC. We also updated the WACC assumptions in line with the new guidance in the relevant cost methodology. The Financial Information File allows now for a manual computation of the date of entry into operation. We also added some warnings and checks to facilitate the calculation of the gearing ratio for the WACC in line with the relevant costs methodology. Finally, we slightly adapted the cost efficiency formula to ensure that the numerator of the cost efficiency also takes into account any OPEX subsidies applicants may receive during construction, when relevant for your project. I will now move to the Financial Information File template Excel sheets. The first tab that you see is the Disclaimer tab, which I encourage you to read. As indicated, it is a reminder that the assumptions and financial projections used in the Financial Information File are based on the applicant's own detailed financial model. The second tab is the Introduction and Definitions tab. This tab gives you instructions on how to fill the template and a short reminder of the items that are eligible for the relevant cost computation. Please always consult the relevant costs methodology guidance, as you will find more details in that document. One word on instructions. The template includes sheets in three main colors: gray, blue, and red. The gray ones include the usual disclaimer, introduction and definitions, model check and history of changes. The blue ones are the sheets that you will need to fill and should really focus on. The red ones are the sheets that show automatically the results of the calculation and should not be touched. In the input tabs, please fill in only cells highlighted in yellow. Values should be filled in with the correct sign. For example, ensure revenues have positive signs and costs have negative signs. Your projections must be provided over the operational lifetime of your project and not only for the first 10 years after entry into operation. Finally, do not to modify formulas anywhere in the spreadsheets. Let's start now with the sheets that need to be filled, which are the ones in blue. You will need to follow the following steps. First, fill in the financial model summary input sheet, then the Capex input sheet, then the relevant costs input sheet, and finally the grant breakdown input sheet. I will move now to the first blue tab to be completed, the financial model summary input sheet. The first step is to input general information on your project and select the appropriate relevant cost methodology. To start, you need to insert project name, select the country in which the project will be implemented and select the units of the financial data of your model. Please ensure consistency in the units used for all data introduced in the model. For the selection of the relevant cost methodology, the drop-down menu allows you to select between the no reference plant, which is the default methodology, and the fallback option, which is the reference plant methodology. Please consider that you can choose the reference plant methodology only under specific conditions. I invite you to carefully read the relevant costs guidance if you decide to use it. If you select the reference plant, you will have to fill the relevant costs input sheet, which would otherwise be left blank. I will come back to that later. In the project timing and assumption section, you are then asked to insert general information on corporate tax rate and the timelines of your project. The project starting date is by default the first day of the month following the grant agreement signature, which is tentatively planned in January 2027. But since this cell is in yellow, you can adjust this date to align with the timeline of your project. You will also need to insert the financial close date, the construction start date and the planned date for entry into operation. You will also need to specify the expected lifetime of your project and the duration of the Innovation Fund support. This represents the period from the project starting date to the end of the Innovation Fund monitoring period in months. An attention point: please provide your projections over the entire operational life of your project and not only until the end of the Innovation Fund monitoring period or during the first 10 years of operation. Failure to comply with this requirement may be penalized during evaluation. In the next section, you need to insert the parameters of the project's weighted average cost of capital, the WACC. Please pay attention that it is essential to calculate a project WACC based the relevant costs guidance on the cost of equity and cost of debt. Carefully read the relevant costs methodology guidance for instructions on how to fill this section. Failure to calculate the WACC correctly is one of the pitfalls that may be penalized during evaluation. For the levered beta and equity risk premium, we introduce default values respectively of 1 and 6%. If you justify it, you may use another value for the ERP within the boundaries allowed in the relevant costs methodology. However, this needs to be thoroughly justified in the business plan and Part B of the application. Failure to provide sufficient justification will be penalized during the evaluation. The risk-free rate needs to be taken from Appendix 2 of the relevant costs guidance. It is automatically computed based on the country of implementation inserted above. The innovation risk premium reflects the innovation risk. The default value for the innovation risk premium is 2.5%. You may increase up to 3% for highly innovative projects. However, this needs to be justified in the business plan and Part B of the application. Failure to provide a thorough justification will be penalized during the evaluation. For the calculation of the equity and debt portion, please pay attention that the total capital, meaning equity plus debt, does not include the Innovation Fund grant or any other subsidies. Make sure that the equity and debt portion of the total capital used in the WACC formula are consistent with the financing plan presented under construction funding sources in the section below. In this illustrative and fictitious example, equity represents 80% of the total value of equity and debt. Under the Funding Sources section, you will need to include all the funding sources expected for the development and construction of your project. Funding sources also include the portion of the Innovation Fund that will be disbursed before entry into operation. We have introduced some checks in red to help you ensure the consistency of data presented in the funding sources other sections. In particular, in the columns on the right, you can see the total value of capital and the share each source of financing represents out of the total capital. Please read carefully the relevant methodology to compute the equity and debt portion in the WACC calculation since, for instance, shareholders' loans or other debts raised with a guarantee of the mother company must be considered as equity. The lines below the funding sources table will help you ensure consistency between the financing plan presented under the construction funding sources section and the equity and debt foreseen before entry into operation in the cash flow statement. In the next section, you must include the total GHG emissions avoidance for the first 10 years of operation. This value should be copied from the computation made in the GHG emission avoidance calculation tool. In the section below, you will have to input data related to the profit and loss of your project. Please pay attention to the units of volumes and prices. If you can sell free ETS emission allowances or monetized CO2 certificates, please insert the associated revenues under operational benefits. If you expect national state aid subsidies or other EU funding during the operational period, insert data in the rows related to other public OPEX subsidies and over the entire period when the support is received. Do not limit yourself only to 10 years of operation. Below you can insert any OPEX savings you may have. We move now to the OPEX part. You can include the cost of goods sold and other operating expenses. Note that you have a row for OPEX that are not eligible for the relevant costs calculation. You can insert SG&A and depreciation. You also have a line if the Innovation Fund grant or other subsidies can be recognized as a reduced depreciation expense. Next, you will need to input the interest rate expenses and taxes. This concludes the P&L section. We go now to the cash flow statement section. You will see that some cells are highlighted in green. They relate to the Capex expenditure plan and the grant disbursement. These cells will be fed from other blue sheets, so you do not need to modify them in this tab. In the row related to Capex items not included in relevant cost, you can add Capex items which are not eligible for the relevant costs calculation. In this line you need to include maintenance Capex. It is important that maintenance Capex is only inserted after the defined entry into operation date and is truly related to maintenance costs that are needed to maintain the operational capacity of the plant and not to the expansion of its capacity. Please read carefully the relevant costs methodology on this point. If you receive other grants related to the development and construction of your project, you can include them under other public Capex subsidy. Next, you need to provide input related to your financing, equity and debt, dividends, shareholder loan repayment of principal and interest. There is also at the end another line where you can insert other cash flows from financing, for example additions to the debt service reserve account. Finally, in the last section, you need to provide the main parameters of your balance sheet based on your own detailed financial model. We will go now to the Capex input sheet. In this tab, you will need to input your Capex projections on a quarterly basis. You must include the main Capex items, construction, site infrastructure, and development costs. Carefully read the definitions provided in the glossary of the relevant costs methodology to make sure that you only include costs that are eligible. For example, costs incurred before the submission of your application are not eligible for relevant cost computation. Please do not include them as eligible costs. You may sign a contract or make an order before submitting your application. However, if any prepayment made or invoice is issued before this date, then the associated costs will be considered as non-eligible. You can include those non-eligible costs in the line related to Capex items not included in relevant cost in the financial model summary input sheet. Another attention point, make sure that you do not include Capex after the proposed entry into operation date. If you do so, there will be a warning sign here. In addition, check in the rows at the bottom of the tab if the grant allocation that you propose in the Grant Breakdown Inputs tab is proportional to the Capex profile presented in this sheet. In this example, the grant requested is lower than the Capex expected until financial close with a comfortable buffer. The next tab is the Relevant Costs Input sheet. This tab should only be filled if you choose to use the reference plant methodology for the relevant costs calculation. In this example, the no reference plant was selected, hence the sheet will be left blank. For sake of illustration, I will now select the reference plant methodology in the Financial Model Summary Input tab. If we select the reference plant methodology in the drop-down menu, you will see that you are now asked to fill parameters for this reference plant. In particular, you will need to input the WACC associated with the reference plant, as well as projected revenues, Capex, OPEX, and maintenance Capex related to the reference plant. Please extract these values from the more elaborated details provided in your detailed financial model. Please carefully read the relevant costs guidance for more details and instructions related to the reference plant methodology. I will switch back now to the No Reference Plant Methodology option in the Financial Model Summary Input tab. Finally, I will briefly cover the Grant Breakdown Input sheet. This is where you input the proposed grant amount payments in line with the work packages defined in your application. This sheet can only be filled once you know the maximum grant amount that can be requested. You will find this information in the relevant Cost Calculation tab. You will see in this tab the estimated amount of the relevant cost for your project based on the assumptions you inserted in the previous tabs. In this example, the relevant cost is €139 million. You can see that maximum grant you can claim is €83 million. In this fictitious example, the applicant only requested €25 million. We can now go back to the Grant Breakdown Input sheet. In this sheet, you insert the proposed grant for the different work packages. Please bear in mind that the disbursement must be defined according to the rules set out in the call text. In particular, take into account that a maximum of 40% of the total grant requested can be disbursed up to financial close, and at least 10% of the total requested grant must be requested during the monitoring period after entry into operation. The remaining amount can be disbursed during construction, between financial close and entry into operation. As you see in column Q, you need to indicate the distance from the project start date and express this in months. In this example, the requested grant is EUR total €25 million with 15% paid at financial close, 75% at entry into operation. We also have 5 annual installments expected after entry into operation, representing 10% of the total grant requested. We can now quickly review the output sheets in red. In the Financial Model Summary sheet, you will find a summary of the profit and loss, the balance sheet, and the cash flow statements. Below, you find the calculation of the internal rate of return without Innovation Fund grant and with Innovation Fund grant. If you assumed other subsidies, the analysis will perform the calculation excluding and including these other grants. Finally, at the bottom of the tab, you can find a calculation of debt service coverage ratio to cater for the event if your project is expected to raise debt. If we move now to the relevant cost calculation sheet, you can see the details of the calculation for the no reference plant. The template will automatically select the data for the period during the first 10 years after entry into operation. Finally, you can find the calculation of the requested grant. Attention point: when you submit your file, you will have to encode in Part A the amount of the grant and relevant costs expressed in euros. For this, you need to use the figures rounded to the nearest euro. Please follow this instruction and do not deviate by encoding values with a different format in Part A. Next is the Cost Efficiency Ratio tab. The cost efficiency ratio is the ratio between the requested Innovation Fund grant and the GHG emission allowances during the first 10 years of operation. If other public support is expected from another EU funding program or state aid in the form of Capex or OPEX grants in your projections, this will be automatically added to the numerator of the cost efficiency ratio. The next sheets enable you to see the data in various forms. In the summary chart, you will find the NPV analysis, the key dates of your project, as well as key metrics shown in the graphs. For instance, in these 2 new graphs, you can quickly see the assumptions made for prices, cost of unit, volumes over time. You also have an overview of the funding sources and uses table, which is important to verify that the development and construction of your project is fully funded. In the model report, you can find a condensed overview of the projections and key indicators. The Part C support sheet provides you with the calculation of some of the data that you need to insert in Part C, where you provide key indicators of your project. The model check will help you to quickly spot any potential errors in the model, cash flow reconciliation or balance sheet check, or a potential mismatch in the proposed profile of grant payments against the proportionality requirement. Finally, you will find the tab with the history of changes. With this, I covered the entire financial information file. A word on the Innovation Fund Help Desk. This tutorial has been prepared to help you complete the financial information file template. If you still have questions, please contact the Help Desk. The Help Desk link is available on the Funding and Tenders portal. When submitting a question, follow the provided instructions carefully. Read the published heat auction Q&A before contacting the Help Desk, as many details are already covered there. Be concise and clear, including only the project information necessary to answer your question. Do not ask questions about other EU programs or questions requiring opinions or judgments, as the Help Desk will not be able to provide answers to these cases.
On this slide, you can find the different links to the Funding and Tenders portal, which include the various tutorials and FAQs. You can find more information, planning of new calls, recorded webinars, and videos on the Information Fund website shown here. Or you can go on YouTube on the page on Innovation Fund with the link on the right-hand side.
This concludes the Financial Information File online tutorial. Thank you for listening and for your interest in the Innovation Fund. We wish you the best of luck with your future application.